to prefer one another. Forgive as He forgives. When we live as one, we all share in the love of the Son with the Father and the Spirit. So with one voice we'll sing to the Lord, and with one voice we'll lift out His word, till the whole earth sees the Redeemer has come, for He dwells in the presence of His people. So with one voice we'll sing to the Lord, and with one voice we'll lift out His word, till the whole earth sees the Redeemer has come, for He dwells in the presence of His people. For He dwells in the presence of His people. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey, and the honeycomb. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey, and the honeycomb. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey, and the honeycomb. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be accepted in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey, and the honeycomb. And in keeping of them there is great reward, there is great reward. before all of creation, all that I see. You stood alone in your glory, eternally. Then with a word you created galaxies formed at your feet. You're the highest of all, you're as high as can be. Glorified on the throne, give praise to the King. All of heaven bows down in worship to thee, Lord. You are, O Lord, by far highest of all. Who, Lord, can fathom your power, mercy, and grace? Raining your blessings upon us all of our days. Love beyond all understanding, humbly we offer our praise. You're the highest of all, you're as high as can be. Glorified on the throne, give praise to the King. All of heaven bows down in worship to thee, Lord. You are, O Lord, by far. You're the highest of all, you're as high as can be. Glorified on the throne, give praise to the King. All of heaven bows down in worship to thee, Lord. You are, O Lord, by far highest of all. Yes, Lord, you are highest of all. There's a place where mercy reigns and never dies. There's a place where streams of grace flow deep and wide. Where all the love I've ever found comes like a flood, comes flowing down. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in all of you, in all of you. Where your love ran red and my sin washed white. I owe all to you, I owe all to you, Jesus. There's a place where sin and shame are powerless, where my heart has peace with God and forgiveness, where all the love I've ever found comes like a flood, comes flowing down. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in all of you, in all of you. Where your love ran red and my sin washed white. I owe all to you, I owe all to you. Here my hope is found, here on holy ground. Here I bow down, here I bow down. Here arms open wide, here you save my life. Here I bow down, here I bow. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in all of you, in all of you. Where your love ran red and my sin washed white. I owe all to you, I owe all to you. I owe all to you, I owe all to you, Jesus. together in spirit, in faith and unity, where the bonds of peace, of acceptance and love are the fruit of his presence here among us. So with one voice we'll sing to the Lord, and with one voice we'll lift out his word till the whole earth see.
Look who's here. Whoa. Is everybody here? The whole family? Okay. Okay, thumbs up. Good evening. Good to see everyone here this evening, especially if you're visiting with us. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you if you're joining us online for our Wednesday evening Bible class. We're going to make a few announcements, and then we'll have a couple of songs and a prayer and be dismissed to our Bible classes. The Anglin family is back for a visit tonight, all four, so great to see you. Make sure you get a chance to say hello to them. I'm very happy about that opportunity. There's some folks we need to be praying for. Harry Tomlinson is in Inova Children's Hospital. He's being treated for RSV, and he's responding very well. Things are going really well, and hopefully he'll get to come home tomorrow. So let's keep Henry and the whole family in our prayers. Good to have his brother and sisters here with us this evening. Jairus Bullard had his first cataract surgery on Monday, doing well enough to be here and to drive here, so we're happy about that. Didn't want to keep him in prayers. Donna Rodriguez has an upcoming surgery next week on October the 3rd. That's one that has been scheduled and rescheduled several times. We heard this evening that Amber Sullivan just found out that she has a melanoma, and I think they're planning to remove that next week. Amber, is that right, Tuesday? Next Tuesday. So let's be praying about that. We also heard Sunday that Carla Shepard's father, Carl Jones, who is a preacher of the gospel in the Atlanta, Georgia area, is on the wait list for a kidney. And so he's been awfully sick, and he's on the wait list for a kidney. So let's keep him in prayers, and I'll try to get an address for him so that we can be sending him cards of encouragement. And we also received word, we've been praying for Lolly and Rena's dad, Dennis McCarty, who had open heart surgery recently. He's feeling much better, as the note we have is already being more active than his doctors would like. And so we want to be thankful for that as well. A lot of folks to continue to pray for. Let's not forget our expectant mothers, and it's certainly on our hearts and our minds are all of our brothers and sisters in Florida who are in the midst of dealing with Hurricane Ian at this time.
Special prayer tonight. I just got contacted by Toby John in Sebring, Florida, and his house is on fire.
Oh, no.
Transformer went down behind his house.
Okay.
Fire department came,
Wow.
and had them leave the house. I'm not quite sure the exact circumstances.
Okay.
The fire, because of the electric, so
Yeah.
the decisions were made. They left.
Yeah.
And it seems to be either at that time or just after the house caught on fire.
Yeah.
He did it down in the Facebook Messenger, and his house was on fire.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I had to contact the secret congregation so far that I left.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we've tried to be in contact with folks in Florida, and as early as the early afternoon, everybody was losing power. And so let's keep everyone in prayers. You may not have heard, but Togba John and his family, they used to be members here. In fact, we invited them in from Liberia when they moved to the country, are in Sebring, Florida, and have been for several years. and that congregation has been good to receive them as well. His house is on fire, and he got in contact with Phil Taylor over Messenger, right? You didn't talk to him. You did not talk to Togba John. Facebook Messenger, he got you the message. Okay. Transformer went down behind his house, and now his house is on fire. So let's keep Togba John and his wife and the boys in your prayers. Okay, be praying about that. Some upcoming events we want to mention. Men's retreat at Camp Omava. The topic is raising your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Dads are welcome to bring their children. And see Mike Mendez for more details. Plan for rain the whole weekend. Just a heads up. That's what we're going to get. It's going to rain the whole weekend. So plan for that. There's a kids service activity on October the 8th. That is Manassas kids service activity. Excuse me, not the 8th, is it? It's the 7th. That's correct. It's the 7th, and it starts at 5:30. That's correct, too? That starts at 5:30? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. It's on the 7th, and it starts at 5:30. And so we do want to mention that. That's coming up in just a couple of weeks. There'll be a baby shower on the 16th in honor of Rianne Rouse and Sebastian Lopez and their baby girl at 3:30. This is a male-female shower. Men and women are both invited, and Rianne is registered at babylist.com. We also have an announcement on your announcement sheet about the Magi boxes, and we're collecting for them right now. The main needs are school supplies and flip-flops for boys, but there's going to be a packing party on the 5th of November, first Saturday in November. So stuff needs to be in before then, and want to invite everybody to that as well. I know David will say a little bit more about that in just a second because he's going to be leading us in song. We're going to have a couple of songs and a prayer, and then we'll be dismissed to our Bible classes. David?
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize that the Magi box packing party doesn't happen without your support. In other words, we have to collect the stuff that gets packed in the boxes. We have a lot of it, but we need some more. And each week, look in the bulletin, you'll get a different list of things that we need to bring in, because as you bring them in, we're counting it up and making sure that we've got enough stuff, and then we'll direct. But right now, it's school supplies, everything that qualifies for that, plus the flip-flops. Anything else, Karen? Is that? And Karen is the brainchild on this. So anyway, our first song tonight, 350, 350, Jesus Hold My Hand. As I travel through this pilgrim and this land, you walk with me. Please be safe with singing, that is Christ of Calvary. This would be my reward, and help to the best I can. For I need thy light to guide me in thy rest. book, it'll be 438. My hope is built on nothing less. 438. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I cannot trust the sweetest frame, but only lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand.
Despite the problems in Florida and many other places, we have a lot to be grateful for and a lot to be thankful for. So please join with me as we enter this time of prayer to our Father in a prayer of thanksgiving. Thank you, God, for your amazing power and your work in our lives. Thank you for your goodness and for your blessings over us. Thank you for bringing us hope even in the toughest of times, strengthening us for your purposes. Thank you for caring for the many sick of this congregation and around the world, and particularly those who were mentioned earlier. Thank you for caring for the Gillette family as they prepare to move to Michigan. May they take our love with them. And we ask specifically, Father, and thank you that you will care for our family in Florida who have a house on fire, or did have a house on fire. We entrust you to care for them. Thank you for your love and care. Thank you for your mercy and grace. Thank you for always being with us and never leaving us. Thank you for sacrificing your Son that we might have eternal life. Please forgive us when we don't thank you enough for who you are, for all that you do, for all that you've given us. Help us set our eyes and hearts on you anew. Please renew our spirits. Fill us with your joy and peace. We love you. We need you this day and every day. We give you praise and thanks, for you alone are worthy. We pray this through our Savior, your only Son, Jesus. Amen.
Brought a snack. I'm still full. Oh man. It was that second serving. It was the second serving that did me in. I told somebody, I said, I don't want dessert, I want to go back and have seconds. And that was probably a tactical error on my part, but it just tasted too good, so. Oh. that. Good. My checklist. What's funny? I should have 3. All I got to do is go this way or this way. Yeah. See? And my chicken sandwich. Okay. Good evening. And I was watching. You know, we always talk about a storm coming, and then when it hits landfall, on my business call this morning, there were 7 people, and I was the only one not in Florida. They were all in Florida, talking about how power was about to go out and all that kind of stuff. So, and it looks pretty bad. Just, those weathermen go down there, and they stand there waiting for a garbage can or a stop sign to hit them. I guess they get paid for that, but anyway, that's how you find out what's going on, I guess. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to finish up, wrap up, quick review of the ending of chapter 2. We want to make sure that we have that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in place, and talk about the 5th kingdom, which we never got to, which was the most important part of that vision, the dream that he had, and then Lord willing, we'll move on into chapter 3, which we know deals with fire. I like to name these chapters. I call that one, I Fell into a Ring of Fire. It just helps me remember what the chapter's about. But anyway, but before we do that, somebody kind of came up to me after last week and wanted to chat just a little more about the names of the gods and the names that people, countries, empires, kingdoms like Babylon gave their prisoners and why. And so there's probably a much deeper study into what kind of gods and what their names were. But for the most part, what you hear is when you're reading through the Bible, you hear gods named Marduk, Nabu, or Nabu, which sounds familiar, right? Timing is perfect because this is the culprit here that made me talk about this. But for good reason. Bel was the name of a god, and Aku was the name of a god. So when you hear names like Belteshazzar and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they all kind of point back to these gods' names. What's interesting about these is when you take their Hebrew names, which again in this class we've got to make sure that we never get caught off guard with what those names are. They are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But what's interesting is Daniel's name in Hebrew means God is my judge and or God protects me. Belteshazzar means Bel protects me, or is my God. Mishael, his name in Hebrew was who is like God, or more specifically, who is like El. And his slave name, Meshach, is who is like Aku. So it's almost like they took their Hebrew names and said, well, we're going to kind of give the same thought, but it's going to be our gods and not their gods, which is essentially what happened. Yes, sir. Okay.
To show that our gods are superior to your God.
Yes.
As you already said, like the El and the Sale, and that is short for Elohim, which is the word God.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael has the El.
Mm-hmm.
And like Daniel says the El. And then Azariah has the AH, Hananiah has the AH, that's short for Yahweh.
Right.
They carry the name of God.
Right. And I'm not sure what they called each other privately. I'm not sure about that. We hear their names used different in Hebrew and then their slave names. But anyway, that's the association. And the other one was, and this was pointed out to me, Abednego. Now, I went back and I actually did make sure that I knew how that was spelled correctly. But when you put those two together, at least maybe me, you have a tendency to put the N in front of the D. And it comes out Abednego. And it's not Abednego. And if I said that real fast, but my bad. It is Abed, as named by the god, and then Nego, and that's just the way they are. So, and I tried to go back and actually find how these names were actually pronounced in those languages. Couldn't find anything, and I don't know that I'd be able to do anything with it if I did, so it's not important. But the names of who they were and the changing of the gods, I thought that was a good point to bring up. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll show you later. All right. I'll give you a shot.
Like I say, even if I heard it, I'd come up here and sound like I was speaking in tongues or something, or what people think of speaking in tongues. I would be trying to speak in tongues. That's right. It would be exactly the definition of speaking in tongues in real time. So yeah, that's good. But anyway, just a good fun fact about those names and what we should know about them if we're studying Daniel. And as we remember last week, the king had this dream that was very disturbing. And although a point not to wrestle with too much, there was this question of, did he really forget the dream? Or did he just know the dream and was putting everybody to task? I had mentioned, and Diane showed me, and I looked in a couple other verses, the original American Standard Version in King James actually include the language, "the dream left me," which kind of gives us the thought that maybe God did cause him to forget it. And when you think about it, there's a reason for that. Because if he did remember the dream, now God would still be in control of all things, but if he had remembered that dream, what would the outcome have been? He would have called his wise men, told them the dream, and Daniel wouldn't have been in the play. So it's almost by, if this is the case, and this is just my opinion, by him forgetting this dream, it leads us to Daniel and his ability to come back and tell him what that dream was. Which, by the way, at the end of this, you ask the question, why did the king buy what Daniel was selling? Well, the answer is because he told him something nobody else could possibly know. Even his own wise men said, ain't nobody on this planet that can tell you what that dream was. It's impossible. I mean, what they were saying was, well, we're smart, but this don't cut it. And even Daniel comes back and says, he's right. Nobody on this planet can do this. Only my God in heaven can do this, and he reveals this dream. And he goes back and he tells them the dream and what it meant. The head of gold was, of course, Nebuchadnezzar himself, which must have made him feel pretty good and maybe obvious to him. Although what he says next probably didn't make him happy, which meant there's going to be a kingdom that's going to follow yours when yours fails. And that is the arms and the breasts of the silver, which we determined was the Medo-Persian Empire. And again, you'll go to some places and they'll say Medo was the second nation, and Persia was the third nation that controlled the world. Historians quickly come back and point out that the problem with that is that Persia never conquered Greece, or the land that was Greece. So it doesn't fit the definition of, when we get to Greece, the third kingdom, of conquering and controlling the whole land. History tells us it was a Medo-Persian relationship. Kaufman says this duality of the breast and the arms being silver represent two parts, two nations. Medo-Persian just seems to make sense. And then on top of that, they were the nation who started using silver as coins, another assignment, to that nation. And then, of course, the fourth nation was the belly and the thighs or the third nation, the belly and the thighs of bronze, which represents Greek and Greece for a lot of different reasons. Again, Kaufman suggests that the term belly or stomach, or however it reads in yours, is actually plural. Maybe not so much two stomachs, but two sides of the stomach. First thing I think of is when we all think of people who have six-packs, the two muscles on both sides. And us men, we like to say we all got six-packs. It's just covered with a lot of fat. And so you can't see them, but they're there. They're there somewhere. And so he basically makes the suggestion you have two sides of a stomach and two thighs, which inevitably happens to Greece as they break up into those four kingdoms. And he uses that to kind of point to them. And they were an army and a nation of bronze. Bronze armor, bronze chariots, everything was made bronze back in those days. It makes sense. Then, of course, the fourth leg was the leg of iron, and the feet of iron, and the feet iron mixed with clay. And he tells us that mixture of the iron and the clay is brittle. And we're told that it's the seed of man that made it brittle. Like many other kingdoms, Romans far overextended themselves with their nations, and over a period of time, the intermarriages, all they wanted was to have everybody unified as Roman states all across the world. Well, they never got that way. They never became unified. There was never any unity, and over time, that posturing of putting your people all over the place in the land grab just makes you weak and vulnerable, and so that kingdom didn't last either. Now, it lasted a long time for reasons that we'll talk about again shortly, but not the way that they thought. So anyway, in this dream that kind of makes you think, Again, dreams are always more interesting when you're dreaming them. They're always more scary when you're dreaming them than when you wake up and try to tell somebody about them. But we can imagine at least what he was going through, this magnificent big statue and all these different metals that, as we said, they lower not in terms of strength, but in terms of value, each one less valuable than the one above it. A rock that was not cut with hands comes out. And we're familiar with that term too, right from the New Testament. The dwelling God made not with hands, the dwelling made not with hands, and the kingdom made not with hands. Here this rock is taken out, and it wasn't cut out by any human. And this rock smashes into the feet of this great statue and just disintegrates. Dust in the wind. This would be if we were watching a movie, those from the 70s, the group Kansas would step in and sing Dust in the Wind as we watch all these metals in dust form just blow away. And all that's left is that rock. And, how great an association is that with God, who we constantly refer to as our rock. That rock remains, and what happens to that rock? It endures, but what does it do in his dream? It's what it does after it destroys a statue. I'm not going to let you off the hook. It grows and fills what he says the entire earth. Now, in a dream, that gets your attention. So this is what's going on, and you can imagine that if this startled him and troubled him and he woke up, as I say we do sometimes, that dream starts getting away from you. If you don't write it down or something like that, it bothered him enough to be able to make these outlandish threats to all the people about what will happen to them if they don't interpret it. And I want you to remember the part about tearing limb from limb and burning their houses down and make it a rubbish heap, because he's going to use that again. I think he just kind of likes saying that more than doing it, but that's not the first time, that's not the last time he'll say it. Then comes the fifth kingdom in just 2 verses, 44 and 45, at the end of chapter 2. It says, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it itself will endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone that was cut from the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron and the bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy." And again, Nebuchadnezzar believes him. Number one, because the story is believable. I mean, really, when you talk about it, he's talking about kingdoms that will replace each other, and this great kingdom of their Messiah that Daniel knew about what was coming. So accurate is this map of what's going to happen. This is Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's future. And we have the pleasure and the luxury of looking back at it this way and saying, wow, imagine that happened just like he said. But so accurate was this, is that the time that the Romans came, all the Jews, the Jewish priests, the Jewish leaders, they kind of said, they knew, this is when the Messiah is coming, which is why you have so many different sects in the Jewish nation during the time of the Romans. They were expecting them to come. They just had no idea how or exactly when. So you have all these different groups and sects that come together and say it's going to happen this way or this way or this way. One way we know was obvious. They thought he was all going to come back as a warrior and lead the Jewish people to come in and take over the Romans. And there were other thoughts and opinions. But the Jews of that time followed this map that Daniel put out and used it to say this is going to be the time of the Messiah, at least for the most part. Somebody say something? That was a phone. Okay, never mind. So the fifth kingdom, never to be destroyed, crush and destroy all of the kingdoms and endure forever. There is no question in our mind about what that kingdom is, hopefully, at this point. They may have thought one thing or another, at least what the kingdom. Were you going to say something? Okay. Anyway, we know what that is. That is even though these kingdoms that brought us there were godless, they were used by God to bring these things into being. And as we talked last week, each one of these nations, each one of these kingdoms had a specific role in history, including Assyria, which isn't included in this book, but we know Assyria was the beginning of it. Each had a role. Assyria had to be there to take out what was left of the 10 tribes of Israel, disperse them, and leave Judah intact, which is what happened after they did that. Babylon invaded them, but took people from Judah, kept them, kept basically the city moving through vassal kings and all that, but made it a place to be able to go back to. Babylon was the instrument of judgment that was prophesied by the prophets that said, this is what you're going to do and this is how you're going to pay for disobeying me, starting with Solomon all the way back through the split kingdom. Medo-Persians had to be there for a reason. They did what? What's that? They what is it? They're the ones that let them go home. Babylon wouldn't have done that. I doubt if Alexander the Great would have allowed that. But it was Cyrus, basically the tag team of Darius, who goes by another general name that when we get to it, Darius and Cyrus, who basically teamed up over time. But it was Cyrus to let them go home. Cyrus, remember, referred to by a prophet as God's what? Anointed, which is an interesting term they use for Cyrus. Nebuchadnezzar was referred to as God's servant, and he certainly was. He wasn't responsible for all those things he did. God allowed him to do that, and he says as much. So anyway, and then of course the Greeks came, provided for us a language that became the common language of the Bible, starting with the Old Testament, or what was Septuagint, 200 years before Christ was born, thereabouts. Greek language was used to transform the Septuagint into Greek. And then, of course, all the New Testament followed that into Greek and was a common language. Couldn't have done that if Greece wasn't in charge or in a kingdom at that time. And then last but not least, the Romans came, which obviously fulfilled a lot of prophecy about Jesus, but it was the Romans who made open and safe roads. It was the Romans that made open and safe ship lines, boat lines, whatever you want to call them. And those paths that were opened up is what everybody used for some 200 plus years to spread the gospel. On top of the fact of that period we talked about, if you remember last week, Pax Romana, this piece of Rome is what it was called, that had to be in place for the church to kind of survive. If they were all as evil as those first three emperors, the church would have never made it. But that's not the way it happens. Some Caesars came after another and weren't as strict and lightened up on the Christians and let them do more things, and another would come in and be persecuting. But for hundreds of years, this Pax Romana would come in, allowing the church to thrive, allowing Paul to go on his missionary journeys, and et cetera, et cetera. So while you talk about a grand plan, there it was. I mean, Israel had done something bad. Punishment was in store. God promised a remnant, and what a tactical plan that was, to bring nations one on top of the other, to do things that were necessary to bring Christ to this earth. Just a fascinating tale. Were you going to say something, or you just rubbing your head? Go ahead.
With the benefit of hindsight of 2,000 years, so we do see the progression in the gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay, stone. There's another possible interpretation, and it's a little bit more immediate and a little bit more mundane, but from Nebuchadnezzar to the fall, from Nebuchadnezzar as king of Babylon to the last king of Babylon, who was overthrown by Cyrus, who's also called the Messiah by some. The Anointed. It's 5 kings. 5 kings of Babylon, from Nebuchadnezzar to Nabonidus, who's overthrown by Cyrus. Another possible.
Yeah, and you know what? So it's not until you get into right.
But probably there's arguments to be made that they might have seen this prophecy as possible already.
Right. Yeah, and you have other people that say this was written. This wasn't written after captivity; that it was written much further in the future, which gave them the benefit to look back. And yeah, I'm not buying that either. I tend to, as much as I can, read it, yeah, that makes sense. And I can't do it without, you know, scholars and historians telling me one thing or the other, but it all fits and it seems to make sense. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Yes, ma'am.
As a question in my mind was when King of Persia sent everybody back. Now in Germany, when people felt like there were too many Jews around, they felt panicked. And Egypt, when the Pharaoh saw too many Jews around, he panicked. And when the King of Persia decided that there might be a proliferation of Jews, he's like, I think I'll just send you back. I think I'll send you home, and I'll make sure you want to come home, because I'll send your stuff with you. Because there's no more feeling there. And I just think, plus I'm sure God touched his heart to do that.
I think he saw things similar to what
Nebuchadnezzar saw. Nebuchadnezzar was just a lot harder to convince, and it would take chapter 4 to actually put him over the top. But it just seems like he kept beating his head against the wall over and over again and repeating himself. And as we start chapter 3, it's almost tongue-in-cheek funny about the first thing we read in there, despite the dream he just had. But so Daniel just kind of says, this is the story. It's true. It's believable. It's going to happen. And Nebuchadnezzar's response is he falls on his face. Verse 46, he does homage to Daniel, gave orders to present offerings of incense. Surely your God, he says, is a God of gods, a Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery to me. Has Daniel sold Nebuchadnezzar on God? Uniquely? Independently? Yeah, a little bit, as Renee always tells me, a little bit. I say, sweetie, do you love me? She says, a little bit. I'm sorry, sweetie. You're right. I know she's watching me, so I got to be careful what I say. Yeah, he says, you're not the God of all. You are a God of the gods. And it just happens that you've done something better than the rest of them this time. He's not sold yet, not as God being the God. But whatever he saw and whatever he heard impressed him, and he's certainly going to mark that up. And very similar to Joseph, this recognition of this great thing he does gives him a higher post, working directly in the king's court, which is an important thing to know going forward. And Daniel takes that opportunity, since he's now number 2 or whatever number he is in the court. What does he do with that newfound power? Huh? He gets his buddies hired to do something for the city as well, puts them in a good position. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are also city, or what we'd call city officials or county officials or something like that. But they're not in the same place. That's also kind of an important thing as we go forward with this. Daniel's in the court of the king close by. They're out somewhere else, you know. I think I said earlier on, it's like having somebody in the White House and you got friends that you got hired and they're in the Capitol or they're in the new building. Or yes, ma'am.
All the people believe in those other gods, and they don't want to offend the other gods.
Yeah.
So they're just saying, okay, your God's a little smarter than the other ones, but he's still worried about the other gods and the other people believe in them.
This is also the Roman approach, and it goes throughout history. Even early century Japan used to be a country that they wouldn't let anybody come on. It was hard to get on that island, but when you did, you could profess whatever God you wanted, as long as your God you didn't proclaim your God as the only God. And when the Christians started preaching that, this is a quick history lesson, they got to the point where they would put a cross on the ramp when the ships came in. And you had to step, as an insult, you had to step on that cross getting off the ship and getting onto the island. That's how offended they were about it. And of course, there was persecution. Romans, same way. You can pray all the gods you want. Just don't say yours is the only one. And heaven forbid, or Rome forbid, don't say that your God is more powerful than our Caesar, because Caesar declared himself God in many cases. So he's impressed, but he's not sold, at least not yet. And so as we leave chapter 2, and again, we always like to, Daniel's just one of those books that you can read and develop a Christian maturity and mentality from the things he teaches here as you complete the chapters. What I read after I'm done with this chapter is his demeanor and how he responds to things that would maybe scare us or threaten us in it by any other means. The words tell us that he uses here is he used discretion, he used discernment, he used humility, he was calm under fire, under duress, which for the most part with mankind isn't necessarily our first reaction, but this is what Daniel's teaching us as he's going through this. He prayed alone and he prayed with his friends, especially when those friends were in the same boat that he was. Because in this past case, it wasn't a, hey guys, I'm in trouble and I'd like all of you to pray with me so I can get out of trouble. They were in trouble too. Nebuchadnezzar said everybody's going to die if this thing don't get answered. And so they prayed together and that was an answer. And more importantly, I shouldn't say more importantly, as important was what he did after he prayed for that and after his prayer was answered, which is what? He praised God for it, and that's the prayer that we focus on in chapter 2. Not the prayer for, tell me what the dream was, because that's not in there. And that might have been a two-sentence prayer for all we know. But the prayer of praise and thanks after the fact, that's what impresses us, and that's why that's left for us to read and study. So anyway, any last departing comments? I promise I won't keep reaching back into the early chapters. We're going to move on to chapter 3. Yes, sir.
So we looked at the links through two possible interpretations of the dream. And our God did this, so it's possible that they're both correct.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
He gave Nebuchadnezzar something that he could process in his mind, which was that his kingdom would last much longer than it would, because he wouldn't be thinking that his entire kingdom would fail.
Right.
He's thinking he's built something that's going to last.
Right.
You know? Right. So we got to remember, and Diane said it too, God is in control. Right. He's pushing all these buttons and moving these pieces across the board.
Well, that's what's so great about us several thousand years later reading this from the back, because we get to see this magnificent, we get to see the God of history in action, as opposed to back then where they have to say, well, I guess I have to take your word for it. We get to look back and say, wow, the nations came just like he said and historically proven. And even to this day, they find writings and scrolls and artifacts that to build this up more. If you've got the big, thick ESV study Bible, it's big and thick because most of the commentary is in there. They do a really good job of calling out recent finds that support some of these things that we read about and take for granted. I did want to read this before we go. There's a writer named Durant in reference to Rome being that last kingdom that ends up being smashed up but brings Christ into the realm. He writes this, it's just worth repeating. He says, there is no greater drama in human record than the sight of a few Christians scorned or oppressed by succession of emperors, bearing all trials with fierce tenacity, multiplying quietly, building order while their enemies generated chaos, fighting the sword with the word, brutality with hope, and at the last defeating the strongest state that history has known. Caesar and Christ had met in the arena, and Christ had won. I thought that was pretty poetic. I like that sort of thing. Anyway, okay, chapter 3, the ring of fire, the kiln of fire, whatever we want to call it. Somebody read those first 7 verses for me. Give me a voice break. First 7 verses of chapter 3.
Made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up.
Okay, so there's the setup in chapter 3. You can't get through the first couple of verses almost with a smile. Why?
Because he just had a dream.
He just had this dream. We're going to talk about the time frame here, but certainly that dream has just got to resonate in his mind. That he just saw this big statue, and it was disintegrated because basically saying no king will stand and all that stuff. And the first thing he does is over chapter 3, he builds this massive 90-foot, 9 or 10-story tall statue that's probably either one of his gods or his own image, one of the two. But when you're out on a plane and you're sitting on a hill, and they say that the plane in Europe kind of went southeast of the city, and there were miles of it, we probably put that thing on one of the labs, which you probably see that thing 15 miles in the direction of the town.
I was going to say, it shows you the mind of man. He's going to be one that, the statue that he had in the dream, he was the head.
Right.
Now, he goes and says, no, I'm going to be the whole thing.
There you go.
So he makes a statue in his own image, just like him. So he's not going to be outdone. But it also shows you his arrogance that he would do such a thing. He didn't learn anything from that terrifying nightmare. When you remember the nightmare he had, it didn't resonate. It didn't stick with him. That's what I thought.
Yeah, that is just...
To me, that's fascinating. But, well, so a couple of things. First of all, this, of course, is a story of this amazing 90-foot tall, 9-foot wide statue that's gold, probably not solid gold, but probably gold laden. And it's also a story about an insidious backstabbing plot by the Chaldeans. It's interesting, this was not a story of Daniel. This is only a story of his 3 friends, which is also interesting. Because we're going to read through this, and the question that keeps popping in my head is, where's Daniel? And so it just makes it interesting. We again experience the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar. Guy still mean. Even though he praised Daniel's God, he doesn't seem to have calmed down with his temper any. He's still flinging threats around. And again, we see the faith and courage of godly men that just is such an impression upon us. And we might say that they learned that from Daniel, but I would never want to take credit away from them for being just as strong as Daniel before they left Jerusalem as Daniel was. They always seem to be doing things together. Daniel just kind of seemed to be leading the team. And if the order of names means anything, as some people proclaim, they're usually put in the order of age, which meant Daniel would have been the oldest, and in this case, Shadrach would have been the oldest of the 3, who, when they say, we'll read something like, they said in response, well, we know it was only one person saying it, and it was probably the oldest one, probably Shadrach, but we don't know that. We don't know that for sure. The time frame, historians tell us this, and again, I keep mentioning this, I wish I had a copy of a book that suggested what it was, but it was called the Babylonian Chronicles. This keeps popping up if you go into commentaries. And what they suggest is that this is 10 years later, about 10 years later. And what had occurred within Babylon was an uprising. Not an uprising of, like we read before, of a vassal king over in Jerusalem who wants to take sides with Egypt. This occurred within their kingdom. And I guess it was an uprising of caliber that caused Nebuchadnezzar to really have to kind of put his forces together and put this down. Details of the history, I don't know. Might have saw it brewing, might have saw it coming, but anyway, it took quite an effort for him to put it down. And so the suggestion there is, I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. I'm going to build me a statue, and people are going to worship, and the first one that doesn't, I'll kill, and I won't have to worry about them anymore. That seems to make sense if you're going to follow that line of thinking. Because that uprising, obviously those uprisings happen kind of behind closed doors and all that kind of stuff. So, and if you got a problem with me and my kingdom, we're going to test your faith. This statue's going up, and during the ceremony, or probably for that matter, anytime after the ceremony, if you don't, that made me think of stop, drop, and roll. If you don't stop, fall on your face and praise this statue and my gods, you're going to die. You're going to burn in a furnace. There was not a furnace for punishment. There were a lot of kilns because this city was built of bricks. So there's probably several kilns around there that burned at different temperatures and fires that they could control. And if I get to it, I'll tell you a steel mill story because I grew up in a steel mill. I learned to appreciate heat early on at extreme temperatures. But anyway, so this is kind of what awaits them. I'm going to throw you into one of my kilns where we're making bricks, and this is what's going to happen to you when the band starts playing. It's just a message to be subservient and obedient, and if you don't like it, in the fire you go. So then, that word gets out, and this is what follows. Verses 8 through 12. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans, who we know as a class of wise men, came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Now there's these certain Jews. Love that terminology. Here comes the setup. There's these certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, being very specific now, naming Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Here's the backstabbing. Here's the plot. Now here's what's interesting. Who do the Chaldeans work for? Daniel. They work for Daniel. And they're probably sick and tired of answering to these certain Jews who they're talking about. So, and we read of other plots in the Old Testament, how this comes up, Esther and other stories. But they just don't like it. And so they want to try to find a way to do it. They know these certain Jews aren't going to bow down to the king. And so they kind of come with him, a little hobnobbing there, a little, oh, king, live forever. You know, we're yours. You know, we do anything for you. But there's these certain Jews, and it's almost like, you remember that decree you made? Like they got to remind him. Remember that decree you made about everybody who sees the king? Well, these guys aren't doing it. They're not doing it, and we have to hold them accountable. They're not, and they don't just say he's not worshiping the image. You know, they kind of come prepared. They give him this threefold charge, right? They say, one, they're ignoring you. Two, they're not serving your gods. And three, they're not worshiping the image. So it's almost like stacking the charges up against him, which gets the response that they're looking for. Verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar, in a rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men were brought before the king. The king responds to them, you know, almost so he must know them to some point, because the way it sounds is like, is it true? He brings them into his court and says, is this really true? Are you really not doing this? And Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, because basically he's saying, I'm going to give you another chance at this. My edict was to do this, and you're not doing it. So let's get on board and let's do this together. And their response, especially this second verse, the verses I'm looking at are verses 16 and 18, sets up to be what I think, 17 and 18 in particular, just one of the most powerful verses that I refer to as like banner verses. These are things you want to remember, like when Joseph tells Potiphar's wife, how can I commit this great sin and this great evil and sin against God? To me, that's a banner verse. Or David when he tells Goliath, you come at me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come at you with the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. Just to me, there's these verses that stand out. So whoever is doing the talking basically says, King, we don't really need to give you an answer. That we don't have to explain ourselves. Verse 16. O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from this blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. And here's the verse that I love. But even if he does not, and that's the verse that gets me, even if he doesn't, we've already prepared to give up our lives. Even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Again, I'm trying to imagine sometimes how I might respond with the fear of death in front of my face. How ready do you have to be to say, I don't care about this flesh and blood because I trust God to do whatever's necessary? God may call me home. God may save me from this. But, and what they're telling me, he's capable of doing it. We sing a hymn, right? He is able to deliver thee. Is that the term? He'll deliver us if he wants to. But even if he doesn't, this isn't going to happen. Yes, sir.
And so you're absolutely right, I believe, when you say that, you can imagine yourself in a life or death situation, how would you respond, right? Usually, we don't know if that person is serious or not.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was any doubt
No.
that this king was about to do everything that he said he did.
Yeah.
We have recorded in the scriptures some of his threats before
Right.
that were way over the top.
Right.
What we don't have recorded are the things he's actually done.
Right. Right.
They were contributed to.
Right. And in this case, his quick fury catches himself because now he's got other people holding him accountable for what he said. And that if he doesn't do that, he loses credibility as the king. So yeah, he stuck himself in that position. Hang on one second. Yes, ma'am.
About what Isaiah 43 said, and maybe reading this passage. He said, 43:1, he said, fear not, but now this is what the Lord said, he has created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you, I have summoned you by name and your love. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. If you will pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. Flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. It reminds me that they had this promise of knowing that their God was with them. And
Yeah.
they hold on to it.
And probably remember that verse. And you said,
Isaiah 43:2. This one right here that I wrote down. Were you sneaking my notes when I was? And it's a great one. And from a New Testament perspective, there's one we're familiar with, which basically says, don't fear the man that can kill the body. You fear the one that can take the body and your soul. And these men already knew up front, as Daniel said earlier, ready in advance, that I'm going to be willing to do anything I have to make sure that I wind up on the good end of the stick when this is over. Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah. Well, what's interesting is when you get to the point where he raises the fire at higher temperature, it almost defeats the purpose because things happen much faster at those higher temperatures. But the Jews weren't unaware of burning. You may recall that when Judah thought that his daughter-in-law Tamar was sleeping around, what punishment did he recommend for her? To burn her. In Leviticus, and these are kind of outrageous things, but they had to share with it, if you married your wife and her mother, all three of you burned. If you were the daughter of a priest and you committed fornication, burned. So this wasn't a new concept for them, but they were ready for it anyway. And I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead.
When we become a Christian, we learn the Bible, we're baptized into Christ, we stay and say, what our elders read, all through our lives, and nothing is different. The only thing that's different, since the beginning of time, is we're more modern, we have technology, and the threats are the same. It's always about good and evil. So I really wonder, why are we afraid? If we spend our whole life worshiping God, if we submit to God, if we're willing to die for Him, why are we threatened with death?
that's a good I will see you in 2 weeks. James, see you next.
Together in spirit, in faith and unity, where the bonds of peace, of acceptance and love are the fruit of His presence here among us. So with one voice we'll sing to the Lord, and with one voice we'll lift out His word till the whole earth sees the Redeemer has come, for He dwells in the presence of His people. Oh, how good it is on this journey we share to rejoice with the happy and weep with those who mourn. For the weak find strength, the afflicted find grace, when we offer the blessing of belonging. So with one voice we'll sing to the Lord, and with one voice we'll lift out His word, till the whole earth sees the Redeemer has come, for He dwells in the presence of His people. Oh, how good it is to embrace His command, to prefer one another, forgive as He forgives. When we live as one, we all share in the love of the Son with the Father and the Spirit. So with one voice we'll sing to the Lord, and with one voice we'll lift out His word, till the whole earth sees the Redeemer has come, for He dwells in the presence of His people.